Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my AM reading video for Friday, June 19th, 2020. Today is also Juneteenth, which in America is recognizing the end of slavery in the country. I hope this will enter the national and international public lexicon in perpetuity now in more detail than it has before. Because America is going through a bit of a public reckoning at the moment with regards to the treatment of African Americans. To be honest, Juneteenth is something I knew about but didn't really pay a significant amount of attention to before, and that's a shame, and it's really a failing because it is an incredibly important part of American history. Personally, I think it's more deserving of a national holiday than some of our other national holidays. And I didn't think it would be appropriate to let this video go by on posting on this day without giving reference to a very important part of my country's history. The first book I finished this week also delves into American history from an unusual lens where we don't usually see this history come from. I am talking of Passage West by Rishi, which I read as an ebook. This book takes place predominantly in the decade right before, during, and after World War I. It takes place in the Imperial Valley in California, where some Indian Punjabi immigrants are settling and trying to do some sharecropping and trying to make some money and settle themselves either in America or send money back to their families in India. Historically, we're covering a lot of ground. We're covering World War I and particularly how it affected immigrants in America. We're covering British India and the impact of the empire, especially on Indian citizens. And on the state level, we are also covering backlash, particularly against non-European immigrants, and particularly against those who do well in sharecropping and farming, because there's a white supremacist society around them that wants to make sure that white people stay on top. But I do think Reddi bit off a little more than she could chew with this book. She did a framing device around it where she had the first and the last chapters take place in 1972 when the main characters were old men, and I don't think we needed it. I think that the story was self-contained. I also think that she should have focused more on two particular characters and fleshed them out a bit more. The characters being Ram and Karak, who are two men who met en route to America, and Karak convinces Ram to start a cotton picking venture with him that does very well for a time, but then it buttresses up against new laws that were passed in California shortly after World War I, where aliens weren't allowed to own land, and that very significantly altered the lives of Ram and Karak and their friends, a multi-diverse group of friends. They had Japanese friends, and there was a lot of integration with the Mexican community, and they knew some white people as well. But I do think you, along with dealing with these important historical topics and continuing topics, because immigration and who gets to be American is obviously a big theme in this book, but you still need characters and internal conflict. And she had that. She had Ram and Karak, who, you know, weirdly I started thinking of as Eleanor and Marianne from Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, because Ram was the sensible one. He just sort of wanted to keep his head down and get money back to his family and then return to India, but a lot of forces beyond his control were interfering with that. And then Karak was the emotional one who had this dream he wanted to follow and sort of ropes people in and sometimes gets in way over his head. So we had this really good impetus and this good relationship, and I just wish she had fleshed out more of the rest of their relationships and maybe not focused on a couple of the other subplots. I also kind of wish she had focused a little more on the man who became the antagonist, who was a white man, Clive, who started out as a friend to these men. He was sort of overseeing the estate they were sharecropping for, but then the man who owned that estate sold it to Consolidated Fruit, and then Clive moved over to Consolidated Fruit. And with the new laws and everything, his attitude changed. And I thought it would be, and I think there was an interesting comparison to be made, because one of the other random white men who lived in this land came into the picture once or twice, and he was like a virulent racist, like, you know, just absolutely playing the part all the time, just violent and cruel and stupid. But Reddi didn't really include him as much as I thought she might, and I kind of I appreciate that, and I respect that, because Clive is the type of person that I think particularly white people have more trouble seeing as a bad guy, and in fact changes for the worst throughout the book. But I kind of wish if she'd fleshed him out a little bit, maybe we could see more of that change, and just how hard it would be for the main characters to have to deal with this, and also have this proof of what it's like for a white man to just play into his privilege as, you know, it gets easier and easier to get greedy. And then maybe also we could go back and look at times when he turned a blind eye to racism and didn't help enough, and it could perhaps start up discussions about, you know, in today's society we talk a lot about white silence, and that's more or less what he was doing. So yeah, these are things I was thinking about with this book. I mean, it's an impressive book. Reddi put a lot of research into it. I think it took her something like 12 years to write. I first heard about Reddi like in 2009 when I randomly stumbled upon her short story collection, which was 2 years old at the time. An interesting effect of coronavirus too is that because her book came out this year during the pandemic, she wasn't able to do like an in-person launch at a bookstore, so her friends did a virtual event for her that she put on her website, and I'll link it down below. And I just love this sort of stuff because it just makes it all so much more accessible to everybody, and you don't just have to be in one random bookstore in one random place to hear a writer talk about her story and her journey. So I really appreciated it. That being said, I think the weakest part of the story, unfortunately, is that she did a lot of telling and a lot of exposition and not enough showing. So I don't know, maybe she's a stronger short story writer, you know, where you can have to be concise. But overall, I'm really glad I read this. It was a unique reading experience and informative. Next, I have another sharp left turn book, just like last week, meaning that I read the whole thing without previewing it in my last Friday reads. This one is a short story collection called All the Names They Used for God by Anjali Sachdeva, which once again appeared on ebook from the library for me. And it is also, like my left turn last week, part of the Reading Women Awards. The Reading Women podcast was started by booktuber Kendra Winchester and her friend Autumn Privet. And for the past couple of years, they have been awarding the best of for fiction and nonfiction published that year. And I am slowly catching up on that reading list. I've now just completed 2018 with this book. This is an innovative collection. The characters in the 9 short stories in this collection are all powerless and sort of coming up against something powerful that may kind of be beyond their control, and what they do in those situations. The titular story, All the Names They Use for God, has the most religious component, and it's the most, I guess, unusual and recognizable, because Sachdeva does have other historically inspired stories, even going back to the Renaissance in England, but this one has to do with the Boko Haram kidnappings that happened in 2014 or around that time, where they were kidnapping young girls out of schools, and in this case, in this story, out of a church, and using them basically as sex slaves and the like. And this story was narrated by a protagonist who was one of the kidnapped girls, and she's kept in a camp for a while. You know, there's horrible conditions, and then she's ultimately forcibly converted and married off to one of the fighters. And then the story takes a little bit of a surreal turn where she and her friend are able to acquire a mind control power, where they control their husbands and are able to live freer lives and get back in touch with their families. And I don't know, that part to me didn't work. I have trouble with the magical realism, surrealist stuff in, in literary fiction and in short stories. I just never believed in this power, so that took away a lot from the story for me. But if I were to just ignore it and somehow she were able to get free of this man and this organization, as other of the girls have been able to do, I think that there were some interesting questions in there about who are you now to your family, and if you had power over someone who hurt you so much, what would you do? But I think Sachdeva answered that question so much more poignantly in her most realist story, which was called Anything You Might Want. And like most of her stories, it takes place in the US, and it involves a young girl who runs away with a man from her controlling father. But the man abandons her, and later she gets the chance to either have revenge on him or not. And I don't know, I like that story. It might also be the least cynical story, not to be too spoilery. I don't know, I had a weird relationship, I think, with these stories. With two of them, I'm sure my own personal biases were playing a big part in it. Like in her first story, a woman who's very lonely goes caving and sort of has interactions with death. And that reminded me a lot of reading Underland by Robert Macfarlane, where he went to really dangerous underworld places, including caves, to sort of see what life is like under the surface and like what humans bury and what rises up. And in a way that reminded me in a spiritual way of what was happening in this story. And then another story was about a mermaid and a shark. And I just have this irrational fear of sharks ever since I was a young girl, even though, you know, I'm not on the water or anything. But the shark in this story just really brought it back, because there was nothing about this shark that wasn't anything but predator. Even if the shark isn't, you know, a bad guy and just doing his shark things. And the mermaid was a thrill seeker who was drawn to the danger of the shark, and she was a siren who brought him food from all across the seven seas, as it were. I think I'm more okay with fantasy short stories in a way than science fiction ones. There was a dystopian and eugenics-based sci-fi stories in this collection. And it has to do with my personal preferences about world building, because when it comes to fantasy, I'm even a bigger fan of less detailed world building. I feel like there should be unknowables all around, and so that it's okay to focus on characters and the world is a weird, scary place. But when it comes to science fiction, especially social science fiction, I feel like the issues are there to be explored. And it's not about... And it's, you know, it's definitely about the characters too. I always want a strong character with internal conflict, but there has to be more room for the world building for me in science fiction. So there's that. I don't think this collection was ultimately for me, but again, it was unique. And I think a lot of the stories were relatively propulsive. So I'm grateful, because I wouldn't have heard of this collection if it weren't for the Reading Women podcast, and I'm grateful I read it. Next, I just started this book, Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner, which I talked about most recently last week, because I'm in a book club, at least for this month, with my mom and my aunt and some of my mother's other friends, perhaps, as well, a couple of them. And they picked this book. This is actually my mother's copy, which has been on my shelf forever, and it was nearing the top of my Goodreads TBR in a shamed attempt for me to try to force myself to read it as soon as possible, and now we're reading it. And anyway, I'm just a couple of chapters in, and I read the intro by Terry Tempest Williams, and I'm wondering what it's going to be like to talk about this with my mother and everybody, especially since my mother has insisted that I should lead the conversation, because I'm the book club guru and she's sort of just trying things out as she's nearing retirement and that sort of thing. But you know, this book is a quiet family drama about predominantly middle-aged to senior citizen even, I think, couples. and my mom and my aunt and the friends, they're all either married or involved in long-term live-in relationships. And I'm the single millennial, living in the city and not in rural, areas like in here. So I'm wondering about the generational divide in all of this. This is a world that is sort of, seems like right now, the stereotypical middle-class white humanities world, and I am perhaps the most humanities-oriented person in the group, maybe, but this time period starting in the 30s when the men were getting jobs as professors and writers and the women were housekeepers and didn't seem to go into much detail of their own interests outside of the house. And the men are talking about writing about important social justice issues, and I'm just already thinking about how much that terminology has changed and what might be considered writing about important social justice issues from the 30s to the 70s versus now, because younger people now, especially liberal-leaning younger people, are more tapped into a more diverse world. It seems like, and I'm wondering what important social justice writing is to the people in this book. Although one thing that stays the same for everyone, I guess, is we all have that internal conflict of wanting our own lives to feel meaningful, and I think quiet novels still have a place in literary fiction, especially, that there's still something important about the human condition to be said. Or maybe I just hope so, because I have such a novella on submission right now. But yeah, I can't say much more about this. I'm only a couple of chapters in, but I will report back about what my feelings are reading this book and what the discussion is like, because we will be meeting to talk about this in under a week. Hopefully I can get through Crossing to Safety relatively quickly because of that book club deadline, and because coming up the docket I have some chunksters like this one. Well, this is my big chunkster of the month. This is The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration by Isabel Wilkerson. This is a book I picked up last September during a banned book scavenger hunt that the DC Public Library puts out every year. They pick 6 titles that have been banned in certain situations. They usually revolve around a theme, and then they put special covers on the book, which I took off, and hide them in library branches and local businesses, and we get clues and go out to find them. And so I found all 6 books last September, and then I make it my mission to read all of the books in the coming year, and this is my final book, because I decided to start with the easiest book and end with the hardest book. So let me read from the back. In this epic, beautifully written masterwork, Pulitzer Prize-winning author Isabel Wilkerson chronicles one of the great untold stories of American history, the decades-long migration of Black citizens who fled the South for northern and western cities in search of a better life. From 1915 to 1970, this exodus of almost 6 million people changed the face of America. She interviewed more than 1,000 individuals and gained access to new data and official records to write this definitive and vividly dramatic account of how these American journeys unfolded, altering our cities, our countries, and ourselves. So yeah, the first thing I think about is if we had the BookTube Prize back in 2010, and especially the nonfiction division, this one very well might have been on it. Or at least it feels like it should be, because of all of the work that went into it. I'm not actually sure how well it was received at the time, but well enough that it was on the banned book scavenger hunt, and I'm very excited. I haven't been reading this sort of epic social history this month ever since not joining the semifinals of the BookTube Prize, but I'm glad that I now have the time to get to this one. Particularly to loop back to my Juneteenth discussion, because we need to educate ourselves more in this country about the experience of Black Americans, particularly something like this. This was a very significant social movement in our country, and it deserves attention for a lot of reasons because of it. So that about covers it for me now. I'll leave links and information to Juneteenth and the books I discussed down below. So this weekend is Father's Day, and I believe for the second time since coronavirus, I will be heading to Baltimore for a couple of days to be able to see my father. I already just shipped my gift directly to his house. I wasn't able to go for Mother's Day, but hey, my mom will be there, so... And then, sometime after I get back, I will be on this channel to do a page 112 tag, which is my exciting way to add some spontaneity to my reading and yet another book to my June TBR. So stay tuned. In the meantime, I hope you're all having a wonderful weekend with your families or friends or otherwise. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.